Welcome to this session jointly organized by eBay and IEMed in the framework of Aula Mediterrània. It's glad to see so many faces in this very last session of the day. As you know, what we will do here is to discuss and reflect upon two different processes. One, the securitization of identities in the Middle East, and then also how does it translate into the different conflicts that have multiplied, metastasized in the Middle East and North Africa. And we will do it with an approach that will transcend the classical Mediterranean vision. So it's here where we go beyond the limits of the Mediterranean that has traditionally been depicted, because also we will be asking about, because of these shared identities, how also processes of securitization of identities in neighboring regions affect the Mediterranean and vice versa. As you have seen, there is a change in the program because Ranjala Din is sick and couldn't make it. That's why I took the role as a facilitator, and then Ana Ballesteros accepted to also to provide us with insights on her research in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then the impact in the Middle East and North Africa. So it's not always that easy to have a table with friends. And this is a table not only with esteemed colleagues, but also with esteemed friends. Umut Askerimli, whom we have worked a lot, I mean with the three of them, we have worked together for many years. Umut Askerimli is now here in Barcelona as visiting fellow at CIDOB. Also, Ana Ballesteros, so we teach together with Ana and with Lourdes at eBay. Ana also is a research associate at CIDOB, and Lourdes Vidal, well, you know, everyone knows Lourdes. At least they should know you in this room. Come on, and in this initiative, as she is the engine of all this cooperation program. So our proposal is for Lourdes to start first with the case of Syria, because also it's, in terms of intensity of the case, but also because it's what everyone associates with this concept of securitization of identities. Then we'll move to Turkey with Umut Askerimli. And then finally, as I said, we will open our scope to look at these connections between the Mediterranean and its neighbors, so with Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, Lourdes, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to eBay for trusting me with this intervention. Thank you to my colleague Ada Mullol, who has really helped me a lot in putting all my ideas together and sometimes doing some therapy on addressing minorities. Thank you to Elisabetta also, because she has always had a very critical eye on the issue of minorities, and this has helped me a lot to construct this intervention. First of all, I must confess that I have a certain internal conflict in addressing identities, particularly regarding the conflict in Syria. First of all, because identities normally tend to reflect the study of minorities in the Middle East, and minorities is a very elastic concept. It's not only linked to figures and numbers and demographic factors, but it's also linked to the balance of power, to hierarchies of power and interplay between different political actors. So it's quite complicated to define who is a majority and who is a minority when there is no democratic context and the relation of power is really determined by hierarchies of different segments of society. Minorities are normally seen as subjugated, fragile communities, but we can also wonder to what extent, for example, women are a minorized community or segment of population in the Middle East, but we never treat them as minorities. So this is conflictive because the minority issue always tends also to raise some selective empathies from the West regarding certain minorities in the Middle East. And at the same time, when dealing with the Syrian war, it raises two conflicts, which is that if we focus a lot on the sectarian issue, on the issue of identities, we tend to diminish and to discredit all other claims that are behind the conflict, okay? And also, sometimes it leads to a certain this empathy from Western public opinion, since it is seen or considered as something that has nothing to do with us. It's a conflict of identities, and it's a conflict of sects that will not be solved by political means. So this is something that, for me, generates lots of complication. But it is true that these solidarity groups exist in the Middle East and are an essential element in the social configuration of the Middle East. Already even Khaldun in medieval times talked about the Asabiya, the solidarity groups that were created in order to achieve political power. This same social structure might be replied or might be identified today. Sectarianism is something that existed in the region and creates strong solidarity links between people who identify among them, who have a common identity element. And it has been a major driver on regional politics and social organization. It is also much more common in heterogeneous societies. So sometimes this sort of diversity is not well understood from very homogeneous societies, like, for example, ours. One of the things that made me happy while I was preparing for this presentation is the fact that while analyzing from a very focused point of view on sectarianism and identities, ethnic, religious, tribal identities, I found out that really other factors were even as important or even more important than identity itself, because identity was also determined, or these solidarity groups were also determined by rural-urban divisions, by territorial elements, by, for example, the division between the old urbanites and the new urbanites, by class issues and economic factors, which are really very important in the organization of communities at war. So how was diversity managed in the region? Obviously, we have extremely sectorized political systems, like in Lebanon, but then we had, for example, other models of managing diversity, which was the Syrian case. Authoritarianism was maybe not a good way to manage the diversity, but it was a very effective way to manage diversity. In fact, already under the Ottoman rule and under colonialism, sectarianism was a driving force, and at the same time was something used and instrumentalized by rulers in order to create patron-client relationships. In Syria, the Assad style is very particular. It's not only that Al-Assad family belongs to a minority which is Alawite, and it has privileged his minority over the rest of communities of the country, but it is also how, in the way that that Syria was structured and organized territorially, but also administratively, that has also been reflected on how the revolution has developed and how things have gone in the situation of war. The Ba'ath coup in Syria represented a new system of power that favored the revival of sectarianism. Why? Because despite the fact that Ba'athism transcended religious diversity, which did not in the case of ethnicities, because Arab socialism and Ba'athism was very Arabist in a way, it really transcended religious identities, but it excluded directly non-Arab communities. But it was a sort of glue that allowed society to link together. But at the same time, Hafez al-Assad, President Bashar al-Assad's father, constructed a system in which the Alawites were at the heart of the patronage system, which is asking for political support in exchange of material benefits, in exchange of certain positions of power, certain stability, and at the same time, waging the Islamist threat has been something very useful for the regime in order to gather this minority solidarity. Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad's son, just deepened this sectarian perspective by co-opting and patronizing some socioeconomic elements, some socioeconomic segments of the society. Not only, meaning that this system not only co-opted minorities, telling minorities that they would get privileges, but also they would be protected against a majority of the population, which is mainly Sunni Arab, but also it constructed a system in which the military was mainly dominated by Alawites, and where there was a constant discrimination on socioeconomic grounds regarding Arab Sunni populations. One of the main purposes of the sectarian system created by al-Assad was keeping Sunni Arabs divided. The idea of divide and rule was very much promoted by al-Assad. So Syria's al-Assad was not really a nation state, was more a territorial state or a multi-territorial state. And the organization of the territory was made accordingly. In sectarian structures came to the fore when Ba'ath nationalism and this idea of Arab socialism and Arabism dissipated, and the social pact was broken. At that time, particularly in rural areas, which had been mainly marginalized by the regime, facing the state's failure, and when this idea of Arabism dissipated, the sectarian divides emerged to the fore. How was the Syrian population in 2010, just when the revolution erupted? 60% of the population was Sunni Arab, but take into account that this Sunni Arab group is highly divided. It means it's not a cohesive. In fact, the Sunni Arab population is the more divided population. Other communities are much more cohesive, but Sunni Arabs, you might find practicing believers, you might find secularists, you might find atheists, you might find Islamists, you might have radical Islamists. So different understandings and different components of identity. On the contrary, you have 15% in 2010, 15% of Kurdish people, 10% of Alawites, 5% of Christian, 3% Druze, 1% Ismailis, 1% 12 are Shias. So this means that Syria is not a mosaic of population, it's a mosaic of mosaics. Because within each community there is also a diversity, particularly within the Sunni Arab community. Take into account that if you add the 60% of Sunni Arabs to 15% of Kurdish who are also Sunnis, you have an 80% of Sunni Muslims in the country. But we need to add to this fragmentation territorial divisions, tribal and clan loyalties, and also different socioeconomic elements that divide population. Religious belonging is always stronger in rural areas. This is why rural areas tend to be more conservative and urban areas tend to be more prone to coexistence and to different living in diversity. Assad has had the ability to manipulate and selectively co-opt group solidarities and inter-community distrust. The distrust and the tensions that already existed and were historically inherited, Assad knew how to exploit these differences and the mistrust between communities in order to gain loyalties. It's very interesting, for example, to see how urban planning was carried out in Syria. In Syria, we have two models of cities. We have the models of the divided city, like, for example, in Latakia or in Banias, for example, where you have, or Homs, where you have half of the population Sunni Arab, half of the population Alawites. Then you have a divided city, but in the middle, the regime was very careful to place mixed urban communities or centers of power in order to prevent the homogeneity of one segment and the complete homogeneity of one segment and controlling the division line, okay? In contrast, Damascus, for example, is an encircled city, is a garrison city. So Damascus is divided in 4 axes, crossed with lines that are heavily controlled by the military and surrounded by military bases. At the same time, the majority of the population in Damascus is Sunni Arab. So there is no division between half of the population of the city Sunni and half of the population of the city Alawite, and divided, because when a divided city is not only that there's a division of population, but geographically, they are also divided in different neighborhoods. In Damascus, the whole majority of the population is Sunni Arab, divided in these 4 segments, and in each segment, you have different populations of minorities that break homogeneity of the neighborhoods, so that you can have easy control of each sector without having to be careful, because the same composition and the same urban planning allows the control of the population. And this happens with the whole territory. So the main routes that connect the Damascus with the western area, which is traditionally the Alawite area around Latakia and the coast, this route is heavily secured. Okay? On the contrary, more rural areas are managed in a different way, less controlled, and through a system of patronage in which the system made alliances with local notables, to which co-opted one leader of a tribe that was co-opted by the regime, that was given certain privileges, and was a sort of representative that helped control the area, the rural areas. Okay? What happened with the war? The war was not driven directly by sectarianism, but was there at the beginning. So it impacted the conflict very soon. The geography of the revolt will prove as well that it's not so sectarian, but it is also a social divisions that structure the revolt. When we see how the revolt is spread mainly at the beginning in rural areas, this is because there is a socioeconomic claim from these rural areas that have been traditionally marginalized, that have been suffering a terrible drought during the last 5 years, from 2005 until 2010, that has been underdeveloped and underinvested, where the social welfare system is in failure. These areas are the first ones to raise up against the regime with strong socioeconomic claims. But sectarianism is also a consequence of the conflict. It's also a consequence because it has increased and emphasized the sectarian divisions that Syria had already had. So, I mean, communities have aligned or not, depending on their self-interest, on the identity and empathies and solidarity links, but also on a necessity of survival and basic needs. So, for example, Alawites have mainly given support to al-Assad, although there were certain Alawite notables that first at the beginning were critical to al-Assad regime. Druze, for example, that have a history in the country of revolt, they were the first ones who led the revolt against the French in the 20s of the 20th century, and they have this rebellious character. Even though they came and they shared these same socioeconomic grievances, were not so clear and not so blatantly supporting the revolution, because they were hesitant regarding other Sunni Arab members of the revolution. They have been hesitant and they have tried to keep a certain neutrality, okay, until they feared for their life and their existence in their survival in the region, and then they started to find and co-opt with the regime. Ismailis, for example, at the beginning, the Ismailis are a very small community in Syria, very much focused in Salamiya, near Hama and East Hama. And Ismailis at first, they were very much, joining the revolution, but when they started to see the militarization of the revolution, they were scared because of the Islamist threat, and then they decided to side with the regime. Shia communities, 12 Shia communities, non-Alawite Shia communities, they have joined also the regime, not only for group solidarities, but mainly because they have been one of the main targets of radical extremist groups from the rebel side that have attacked Shia communities. And regarding the Christians are mainly urbanized in Syria. Rural areas are mainly Sunni Arab, and they belong to the middle class, to liberal professions, and they are civil servants. They are not monolithic, so the amount of the proliferation of denominations of Christians in Syria is huge. I mean, you have 2, 3, 4 surnames to describe what kind of Christian you are. And they are the ones that have decreased more their presence in Syria since the war. Not because they have been a particular target of violence, but because they have felt very threatened, and they have had also more opportunities to flee. And this is why they were 10% before the war, and they are now around 5% of the population. Half of the community has immigrated. Armenians are the ones particularly affected by this immigration. Sunni Arabs, as I said, is a very divided group. They are not all with the revolution. Some Sunni Arabs have given support to the regime, particularly the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, mainly Damascus bourgeoisie, these business classes that have been benefited by the privatization policies that have promoted the regime. These Sunni Arabs that also have reached some positions of power within the system, because contrary to what we might think, the administration of al-Assad is not only Alawite, it's half Alawite and half Sunni Arabs. That means that they have been wise enough to place some people in the administration in order to have a civil service that is loyal to the system, but at the same time to have a business class that is also loyal to the system. For example, there is a rivalry, a historical rivalry between the bourgeoisie in Damascus and the bourgeoisie in Aleppo, because the bourgeoisie in Aleppo was more conservative, more from a rural origin, and had given support to the uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 80s in Syria. And this deserved for the Aleppo bourgeoisie a punishment that the regime relegated them and privileged the Damascus bourgeoisie. So you might think why Damascus has never really fallen under the revolutionary claims, because it has a very strong support in the city. And courts obviously have followed the revolution as long as it served their own interest of creating an autonomous region in the so-called region of Rojava. Okay, so in order to sum up, because it's very interesting to see how center-periphery divisions are very interesting. Where the revolution started is peripheral. The centers of power have been much more reluctant to raise. The urban-rural divide, the class-based divide. So these people that were reluctant to lose their privileges despite their identity or their group solidarity, okay? And then sectarianism and sectarian massacres started to emerge very soon at the beginning of the revolution, particularly in the hands of the Shabiha, the so-called militiamen supported by the regime that started to repress demonstrations and started to carry out certain massacres in Jasr al-Shughur and in Talkalah, for example, which are the main massacres. I remember also the Al-Hula massacre, which was very, very important. So what is the interesting thing here? The interesting thing here, and I'm going to just jump some of my notes to end up, is that there are two main cleavages within the Syrian conflict, which is the sectarian one, existed there, it still exists and it is increasing, but there's a very strong economic divide, which is very much ignored within the Syrian conflict, which is how there is a class demand, okay, class difference. These urban-rural differences are not because urbans or rurals are different per se, but because there are class and economic grievances, and which might be the scenarios. Obviously, the scenarios are difficult to think. We might think about the united Syria or a partitioned Syria, but what is interesting to see is that by the end of 2015, from those people who had fled the country, 80% were Sunni Arabs. So the idea is that there has been a demographic engineering. For example, the constant strategy of the al-Assad regime of bombing civilian areas in order to depopulate and detach civilians from the rebels, this has created a massive exodus, mainly of Sunni Arabs, who lived in the more targeted areas. This is why now the demography of the country has changed sensibly. And now there are 61% instead of 65% of Sunni Arabs, and the minorities have increased their percentage, except for Christians, which have gone from 5 to 3%, but now Alawites are at 13%, Kurdish are at 16%, so minorities have increased considerably after the war, and also the regional distribution, because internal displacement has provoked a different demographic scenario in the country. I would say that the reality, the population displacement, the ethnic cleansing that has been carried out not only from the side of the regime, but also by the side of certain rebel groups that have pushed for ethnic cleansing, and also from the Kurdish side, from the Arab side, etc. This has led a very different country with more than 6 million people outside of the country, many of them who will be very hesitant and very reluctant to return, because they are seen as people who fled from rebel-held areas, and they might fear of returning and being and suffering revenges. And the reality, also my reality, says that yes, sectarianism is important, but among my friends, I have an Alawite pro-revolutionary friend, I have a Syrian-Palestinian pro-revolutionary friend. These two groups are mainly considered pro-regime. I have a pro-regime Christian father and an anti-regime Christian son, for example, and pro-regime Ismailis. So in Barcelona, which is not the place where we have more Syrians in the world, we have many Syrian people, and we have even Syrian people that defy the sectarian image of the conflict, meaning that not all Alawites are pro-regime, but as a community, they have supported the regime, not only for benefits and economic returns, but also for survival. It's like Christians. When they try to remain neutral or they sympathize with the revolution, they found themselves faced with a very reluctant group of Sunni Arabs, very diverse, some of which were very aggressive against Christians. This is what has prompted Christians to side with the regime or to flee the country. So sectarianism is a reality, but alone cannot explain the Syrian conflict, and often contradicts reality, contradicts this interpretation. So for me, what is important is to see how these sectarian divides intersect with other divides, mainly socioeconomic divides. And then we might even get a very more real picture of the geography of the revolution and the conflict in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Lourdes. So now we'll move north to Syria's northern neighbor, Turkey. So Mutus Krimli on Islam, nationalism, and identity politics in the case of Turkey.
Well, thank you to IEMed and eBay for giving me this chance, and Edu and Anna for inviting me in the first place. Well, to be honest, I was suffering, like most of my friends and colleagues, from a certain Turkey fatigue for the last, at least a year or even more, since the constitutional referendum, basically, in April 2017. Not only, the fatigue, because there was nothing to say about Turkey and nothing, at least I thought at the time, and I still to a certain extent believe, to fight for. But, well, this panel comes at an interesting times, 2 days after an election, local elections, but we're having elections at the rate of 1 per year, so I don't know which one is which. So, everything is considered in a way some sort of referendum with regards to Erdogan's authoritarian regime and all of that. So I think, Britain is trying to catch up with us with all these Brexit votes, but they need a little bit more practice, I think. But, the election results were a little bit shocking. That's the general attitude, is not to be carried away with the results, but something at least, and I'm not going to talk about the symbolism of the elections, which are there, obviously. But what happened in Istanbul, of course, was big, really big. Losing Istanbul to the opposition is some sort of, it showed to many people, including myself, but also people who are living there, who do not have the means to live abroad or who do not have the chance to live abroad because they're deprived of their passports, for simply, signing a petition, for asking for more democracy and things like that. And we knew about the unfair nature of the campaigning process, how they rigged the elections, especially on the election day, if not before. I mean, in the Southeast, they start months before. They move the ballot boxes, people need to travel, and then they send in tanks and the security forces. So, and not to mention the very simple fact that almost all the leaders of the Kurdish party are in prison. And Ankara, I think, you know, the last time it was snatched with fraud, which was even accepted by the OSCE. So it's not, we're not talking about rumors here. But this time, apparently, he just let it go. I mean, because it was obviously, I mean, the difference was too big to cover, apart from bluntly stealing the election. Istanbul, really interesting. I mean, I don't know how much you're aware. I mean, the difference is basically 23,845 votes. And this in a city of almost 15 million people and I don't know, so around, I think, 7, 8 million voters. I'm not sure of the total results. But the symbolism is important because when they won Istanbul and Ankara, I mean, both of these cities have been under the AKP for 25 years. I remember the day Erdogan was first elected, 1993. I was 23, still an undergraduate student. I had, I think, you know, it was my first or second vote, and of course I had voted for the opposition. And I remember, you know, these, the shock waves that were sent around the country when Erdogan emerged victorious. And then, you know, the rest is history. The reason why, though, I'm now going to basically, I mean, this is based to set up the context and give you a fresh look at the context in which we're going to discuss these issues in the next 15 minutes or so. These symbolic victories notwithstanding, we should not forget that the big picture is still the same. We have an electoral autocracy. I know it's paradoxical, but I guess people are now getting used to these things, right? I mean, Hungary, Poland, Russia. I mean, the autocrats of today have public support. No matter how much it is rigged, Erdogan still got 44% of the votes, and the nearest opposition, I mean, it's the second party is 30%, which is really shocking, and that also depends because it was also local elections. Probably in the national elections, the gap will widen again. So, and then Erdogan still has mandate until 2023, and we don't know how he's going to react to the results. I mean, he can as well be a little bit more benevolent, or he can go through, well, the logical conclusion, abolish the elections, or turn them into some sort of Egyptian or Syrian type of elections where he would get 80%, 85%. We don't know. I was expecting that we were already on the way there, but these elections have proven that despite all the rigging, or despite all the unfairness and everything, there's still some sort of working democracy in Turkey. So there is hope, but the country that we're talking about is the same country that we would be talking about if this panel were held last week, for instance. So it's still a full-blown autocracy. And there's no need to be, you know, polite or politically correct with terms. We can as well say dictatorship, this and that. And obviously the dictatorships of today are not the ones of 1930s. And I don't understand people who criticize these analogies because, I mean, obviously they're not. I mean, fascism is still there, but it doesn't have to be Mussolini's or Hitler's running around. Well, you have Putin, you have Orban. I mean, they're not that, you know, except the genocides and all of that. I mean, it's not that different, to be honest. If you ask people who have been, I mean, you know, I have several friends in prison for doing nothing, you know, a civil human rights activist who's been held in prison for the last 3 months because of one single phone conversation where he talks about non-violent civil disobedience acts, because that is defined as terrorism by the state, non-violent civil disobedience. How do we explain these things? I tend to agree with Lourdes that identity is not everything, definitely. But I would add that, you know, identity is also many things, as she also herself pointed out. I mean, so if we're talking about sectarianism, or if we're talking about political interest, values, lifestyle changes, gender, on all of these things are part of the identity depending on how they're defined in particular contexts and by particular groups. So identity means a lot, but my starting point for Turkey would be to say that it's not about religion, it's not about Islam. That's probably the most common mistake that has been made by Turkey experts, pundits mostly, not colleagues, because colleagues are kind of, you know, have come to realize this long ago, that it is all about, you know, an element of the whole regime, which it is. But the point is, I think the more important issue has been, has always been, still is, and not only in Turkey, in the whole world, is nationalism. Now, obviously, the definition of nationalism right now, which is prevalent in Turkey, is different than the one which existed before Erdogan. And yes, the difference is the weight attached to Islam in the current definitions of Turkishness. So basically, secularism is replaced by Islam. Even though, you know, institutionally it's still there to a certain extent. Yeah, I mean, value and the value systems is Islam matters more, and a very sectarian one at that, you know, Sunni version of it. In fact, I mean, you know, if you're a little bit kind of sympathetic to Freud, forgetting about how he treated his own daughter and his obsession with sex, etc., he had a point when he said, I mean, I liked the slip of, you know, the Freudian slip thing. Erdogan's wife about a couple of weeks ago saying that they do represent the caliphate. So, I mean, you know, Caliph is a Sunni institution, okay? So it's very obvious. And while I'm in my conclusion, I'll just very, very kind of broadly go through the regional context. And there, you know, it becomes obvious that they have a certain softness towards Sunni regimes or families or dictators, and softness is very diplomatically put. So we're dealing with a country which is a dictatorship or, well, autocracy. Let's be more polite. But I think the key to understand this is not solely focus on identity. Identity is important, but so is the economic conditions, so are the, you know, the various divisions. So my own kind of conceptual or theoretical instrument to understand Turkish politics, which I share with a number of colleagues, and we came up with pretty much the same idea, completely unaware of each other, even though we're good friends. And I'm talking, but I will give the references. I mean, one is Jenny White in Stockholm right now, the famous anthropologist, and you know, all her books are worth reading. The first one on Muslim networks, the second one on Muslim nationalism, and currently she's working on the clashes of the 70s, the ideological fractions, etc. She wrote an article in Boston Review, which was called Spindle Autocracy. And then I think about 2 weeks ago, German Marshall Fund of Turkey has published a survey and a report based on that survey by an opinion poll expert, survey expert Emre Erdoğan, which is called Tribal Politics. You know, this tribal politics thing is a up-and-coming discussion right now, especially after Trump's elections. I mean, and Jenny has an anthropological take, and you know, we refer to each other's work a lot. Tribal, I have a lot of problems with that word. I agree with the general conceptualization of the whole framework, but tribes has this kinship and blood relations or family relations connotations, which are, quite kind of, it's a slippery slope to something really more essentialist. The idea that we're trying to develop in a forthcoming book with two Swedish colleagues is basically takes the state, the individualism basically, and civil society, which includes, it's very broadly defined, family, civil society organizations, and all of that, thinking about them as a triangle, and then trying to create a theoretical framework to understand various societal cultures or social contracts. Let's just use the old term. Now, that was a comparison of Sweden and Turkey and good old days. Now we're moved beyond that. The Swedish system for them was called status individualism, and based and inspired on this idea, I'm trying to develop this notion of status communalism. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Turkey as just like actually Lourdes said, without using the same terms, we're talking about mosaics. Yes, a lot of mosaics. Non-homogeneous, clustered around different things, but more and more, I would say, around values and lifestyle choices, preferences, rather than obviously ethnicity is still important if you're talking about the Kurds, but Kurds themselves are divided into Alevi Kurds, PKK supporter Kurds, non-PKK, the AKP supporter, Muslim pious Kurds. So, we're talking about, but all of these things are little communities. So Turkey, or, I would say it's like an archipelago of communities in many ways. But what is important in this, and that is why I don't use the political philosophy term communitarianism, because communitarianism entails the idea of diversity which leads to a unity, basically, like the European Union. So you may have dividing things, little units, but the point is there is an overarching system in Turkey, and I think so, if you look at, various polarized countries today, Britain, US, and others, there is no society in the most basic sense we would understand the term. Society in the sense that, with shared values and practices and beliefs, and forget about nation, which is a little bit more advanced than that, because it also is based on a sense of common past and a sense of common future. And that is the problem with this kind of communalism. The status part comes because of the race among all these groups to basically vie for the state to get the benefits from the state and etc. The basic binary between us and them holds. No one listens to each other. The voting is along communal lines or ideological lines, however you want to call it, and there is no acceptance of dissent, internal dissent or critique. And that is why, there is, according to all indexes that you can consider, from the Economist to the Polity Index and etc., or the Freedom House ones, there is now a very clear, not democratization, but de-democratization or anti-democratization trend, varying the theories of democracies. What is new in Turkey? This Turkey has always been like that, probably. What is new in this case is that, of course, just like Trump, we have a very successful demagogue. You want to call it politician, but, if you're talking about Trump, I feel a bit, this unidentified flying object. So, I don't know. What Trump is as politician, or Theresa May as politician, these are kind of contradiction in terms. Erdogan is a much better politician than most of them. So he plays on the fault lines that already were there. He's making the differences more profound, he always talks about survival. There's an existential threat to the Turkish nation, the Turkish state, this and that. And the list of terrorists, believe me, I'm not exaggerating, this is real, include vegetables. I mean, he said that there is a terrorism of tomatoes and aubergines because the prices were rising. So he established free, or cheap stalls to distribute cheaper, in order to bring down inflation, distributing these things to people, of course, in return for votes. And this is important to stress before, if we're talking about identity and all of that, this is not an issue of majority only. The opposition is similarly divided. Liberals hate the nationalist left as a problem with the Kurds, and they don't want to cooperate with them. So basically everybody is contained in its own or in their own community and don't want to engage with the others. So dialogue and all of that is long gone. Basically the situation is, if you've seen it, is like the Monty Python Life of Brian, okay? I mean, you have lots of Judean people's front, and then you have the People's Front of Judea with the slightest and tiniest of differences between their lifestyles and values and the things they believe in, but just because of one minor difference, again Freud, right? Narcissism of minor differences, they hate each other. And that is the thing. Now, so how does this reflect? Okay, I'm not a security expert, just, I'll disclaimer. And Middle East, I've stopped looking and teaching on it again about a year ago for a variety of reasons. But the point is, this plays a lot in this what I've said when it comes to relations, foreign policy and everything. And that the AKP or the Turkish state basically is trying to implement. I would say that this is a mixture of three elements. One is sectarianism, but broadly defined. I'm not fatalistically or a religious believer of sectarianism. I agree with all the critiques of it, including those by Lourdes. But some sort of sectarianism, Imperial Dreams, or give me one last chance of being politically incorrect, I would say Imperial Wet Dreams, and pragmatism. Now that is why, when it comes to Syria, Turkish policy has been changing non-stop. The only thing that has not changed is their determination to crash all Kurdish existence. And they managed to do so thanks to the great power rivalry and the Russian support, because we know that when they shut down a Russian plane and the Russians were pissed off, the Turkish army, the second largest in NATO, they were always told on a daily basis, could not enter into Al-Bab, a very small village, for 2 months because they couldn't take off any flights. And then the Russians said, okay, you can bomb, and then they were there in 3 days. Idlib, we don't know what's going to happen. There's still a lot of negotiations going on. But Turkey, which started as a friend of Assad, then the archenemy of Assad, now is talking about, yeah, but maybe this is the only way. But of course the Kurds should be out. Iraq, they're doing well with the anti-PKK Barzani group, because they know that it doesn't pose a threat. But let's not forget that in the 1990s, when the Gulf War was over, they were opposing that regime as well. They did whatever they could in order to stop the formation of Kurdish regional government. The same goes with Iran, sectarianism. They would never work with Iran or Hezbollah. Israel, AKP is no less anti-Semitic than Poland, but the arms deals are going on really well under the carpet. Well, not so much even under the carpet. And US and Russia, we know. They just play each other. That's why I think, the most important part of Turkish foreign policy in terms of both security and the contribution to regional conflicts is, we're talking about a pragmatist actor, an actor which is not as powerful, as strong, as influential as it pretends to think. So basically, yeah, Turkey is not important, I would say, regionally speaking. If the Middle East is a mess, it will stay as a mess. There was a moment, literally moment in 2011 when Erdogan could have been a unifying factor when he gave this famous televised talk in Tahrir, supporting the Arab revolutions because he hoped Muslim Brotherhood would be in power and all of that. But that moment was like the life of a butterfly. No longer. So, well, if you have any other questions, we can discuss further on later. Thank you.
Now, as I said, we move to the broader Middle East, as some people call it, inaccurately, I would say.
So the importance of Pakistan and Afghanistan is that of the alliances that most countries, that the hegemons of the Middle East can establish with them. And they're important in that way, so they can help equilibrate or not the balance of power in the Middle East. In that sense, Pakistan is one of the main allies of one of the region's hegemon, which is Saudi Arabia. It's been a traditional ally of Saudi Arabia from the 1960s. Let's have a look at the map. So we need to bear in mind where this periphery is, which is not really so far away from the Middle East, after all. So traditionally, Pakistan, you were talking about, Umut, about what's nationalism for Turkey. It's related to Islam. Well, Pakistan existed because of Islam. That's the reason for the state. I don't know how much you know about the history, how Pakistan was born, but it was born out of the independence of India. And there was the theory of the two nations, that the Muslim League, which were the defenders of the idea of Pakistan, were presenting in front of the population, which said that Hindus were a nation and Muslims were a different nation. And after, well, that's a different story. 1947, Pakistan was founded on the basis of Islam. So nationalism in Pakistan is directed completely with Islam. So its identity is going to be Muslim straight away. The problem is, what Islam? Who's Islam? Pakistan is a very varied country, very heterogeneous. We were talking about mosaics. It's another mosaic of beliefs. It's about 95% Muslim. There is like between 15, 20% Shias. But Sunnis are so varied, so different. There are so many different movements that saying Sunni means nothing. You need to say Deobandis, all Deobandis, new Deobandis, Deobandis Salafis. You need to say Barelvis, old Barelvis, new Barelvis, Jihadi Barelvis. You need to talk about different Sufi tariqas. I mean, saying Sunni in Pakistan means nothing. Shia, exactly the same. There are different Shia communities. Mainly, they are identified with the groups and the caste they used to belong at the time of their conversion to Islam. So many of them still retain the name of the caste. So that talks about the origin of these communities as well. Let's go to what's Pakistan doing in the Middle East. Mainly it's Saudi Arabia ally. It's been from the 1970s. Pakistan was born an insecure state. Pakistan's main concern is, and as far as I think, will always be India. and its obsession is India and its insecurity towards India. So what Pakistan did was looking for allies outside the region that could somehow level the insecurity and its lack of material support, material power. And it did it through Saudi Arabia and its material help, not just oil and petrol, but money, and also aligned with the US, which meant in the Middle East, Pakistan straight away was also allied with other monarchies and US's allies in the region. It's had mainly a military implication in the Middle East, especially since the 1960s and 70s. It deployed troops in Saudi Arabia. It has helped Saudi Arabia in many different conflicts and crises it's had. It has trained, the Saudi military has trained other militaries such as Jordanian's military as well. It intervened in North Yemen's civil war in between 1962 and 1970. Pakistani pilots flew Saudi jets and bombed the southern border of Saudi Arabia, for example. And this man here, his Ziaul-Haq, he was a general of the Pakistani military army, and he led one of the battalions that repressed Palestinians in Jordan during the Black September episode in Jordan. So he became really, really like a hated person in Pakistan. But after that, he gave a coup d'etat, and he became the leader of Pakistan for a long time. So what happened with Ziaul-Haq? He gave a coup d'etat. That is just before the coup, the leader was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was a socialist, pan-Islamist, and in order to gain legitimacy for his government, he looked towards the Middle East after Pakistan's partition. You know, Pakistan was divided in two halves. One of them was Bangladesh in 1971. There was a civil war, it separated, and so Pakistan felt closer to the Middle East. And here is the Islamic Summit Conference in Lahore, which was held in Pakistan in 1974. And you can see that's Arafat there, yeah? Ziaul-Haq, the military leader, didn't like that, of course, I'm sure. It's Sadat is there, King Fahd, Gaddafi is there. So he was trying to gain Muslim legitimacy. He was supporting a pan-Islamic perspective besides being a socialist as a leader. So now, Pakistan has been one of those fields where different proxy wars have been developed in three different ways. One domestic, another one regional, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and another one worldwide in the Cold War between the USSR and the USA. So Pakistan has been a scenario of three different proxy wars on its soil. The first one was particularly prominent after the Iranian Revolution. It effectively exported the revolution and it influenced Pakistani Shias. In fact, they formed a political party because in Pakistan, Islamists have always been legalized. So you could establish no matter whichever Islamist party would be legalized and it could go to elections. So this party was a party for the defense of the Shias and for the instauration of the Shia law in Pakistan. What happened there? Identity. Here, sectarian identity was a factor for the resurgence of Sunni political groups that were asking for exactly the opposite, the establishment of a Sunni state. And they had it easy because Ziaul-Haq, the military dictator, was a staunch Sunni. He was ideologically very close to Saudi Arabia, and his lack of legitimacy, he tried to balance by involving Pakistan in an Islamization program, which basically meant a Sunnification program of the country. Of course, the Shias weren't happy about that. Iran wasn't happy about that, but he was lucky enough that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and then he could convince Saudi Arabia and the US to arm these proxies, these mujahideen, and they conveyed them with a Sunni radical ideology in order to expel the Soviets from Afghanistan. So you see the different levels and the different layers of the conflict and how they have tried to leverage the power differences, imbalances, through sectarian component. Okay, there's also an economic factor, but there are many different factors. But overall, that's the main one. According to securitization theory and the definition of calculi and legrency, the securitization of sectarian identities, which involves the elaboration of a security discourse by the state, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and non-state actors, it would be the Mujahideen, as the main tool through which certain key regional players have either attempted to capitalize on domestic instability, that is Afghanistan, resulting from popular upheavals, or to elaborate new defensive strategies. So you've got the part of the securitization in this case. What happens, of course, the problem was that when the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, Pakistan had lots of different groups with a sectarian agenda that had been armed and that had been militant in their approach, and they took the fight from Afghanistan to the Pakistani street. And Pakistan learned that that kind of proxy use would be really bad for itself. So since the post-Arab uprising scenarios, Pakistan has tried to involve itself in the conflicts, but outside the region, and try not to take the conflict in the domestic arena of the country. So for the moment, Pakistan has been involved in 3 scenarios. Saudi Arabia, again, although the parliament did not want to get involved in the conflict with Yemen, the Pakistani military has been involved in the conflict. It's called about 3,000 military in Saudi Arabia, and they're still helping, training military, Saudi military. Pakistani engineers are helping build a wall across the Yemeni border, and some outposts as well. Pakistan was as well involved in the Bahraini protests at request of Saudi Arabia. What Pakistan did was, the Bahraini royal family, the Khalifas, visited Pakistan, demanded their help. And of course, what Pakistan can give, because it has a very big military position, it can help with military training and with soldiers. So they offered military help. They recruited former soldiers and security forces, and the adverts in the Pakistani newspapers, you could read former Soviets, retired soldiers, but they have to be Sunni. So you could see it in the adverts, and I had someone, please translate this to me. Does it say we just want retired Sunni soldiers? And they said yes. So that's one of how they, sectarianize security in that particular way. And also in Yemen, I've already said, it's been involved, although it didn't want to, but that was because when Saudi Arabia asked Pakistan to get involved in Yemen, there was a very strong civilian government, and the parliament refused to get involved, not just because it had seen the consequences for the Syrian government, the repression. It didn't want to get involved in such an unpopular quest. But the leader, or the general, retired general of the Pakistani military, accepted the job of leading the coalition, the military coalition. So it's, of course, Pakistani's military has life of its own. It doesn't need permission from anyone. So he did that as a, slapping on the face of the prime minister. Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan, it's a very weak state, and it's got a very weak regime as well. So Afghanistan's involvement in the Middle East is not that strong, and it doesn't have as much agency. It's everyone else involved in Afghanistan. It's the way around. Everyone is involved in Afghanistan. Everyone wants a share of Afghanistan. And it's another scenario where Saudi Arabia and Iran confront each other. Of course, Saudi Arabia already has expertise from the 80s during the Soviet invasion, and it's a staunch supporter of the Taliban. Iran's position has been more interesting. The Taliban have been staunch opponents of Iran, and they did not want Iran at all to be involved in Afghanistan politics. So while Iran has been involved in Syria, it used its Afghan Shia refugees on its soil and sent them for the Fatimiyun brigades, and send them to Syria to fight alongside Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So that's its way of sectarianizing the Afghan refugees on its soil, Afghan Shias in Afghanistan, because they suffer the consequences of what Iran is doing with Afghan refugees on its soil. And recently, what it's doing, considering that the US is going to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, it's now using its Sunni Afghan refugees on its soil to fight alongside the Taliban against the US. So you see, it's not, well, it doesn't only support Shias, no, it only supports Sunnis as long as they go for the foe, okay? So alliances are fluid. They don't necessarily have to be based on a sectarian affiliation. So that's what Iran is doing now. Of course, let's see what happens when the US withdraw all of its troops, but it looks like Pakistan will not stop supporting the Taliban because they can help Pakistan have strategic depth and have an anti-India regime in Kabul, and Iran is going to support whoever makes sure it's not going to be, there's not going to be a US influence in Afghanistan, and at the same time, Iran is playing its cards with India, allying with India in order to marginalize Pakistan, who still considers an ally of the US. So that is basically the involvement of these two South Asia countries in the Middle East.
Thank you, Anna. We had here also interesting conceptual innovation in a panel where we were discussing about securitized identities, this concept of sectarianized security. So thanks for that. We have, I think, around 20 minutes, 25 minutes for discussion. So we open the floor right now. I will connect several questions and then I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much for those interesting presentations. I have a lot of questions, but I will limit myself to a very small one. I was just very curious about I really love the way you thought the space in your presentation, and I wanted to know if you did any cartography of what you were speaking about, or if you're planning to do it, or if I can find it online.
what do you want? You want to reply immediately?
Very quickly. It's
Okay.
very quickly.
As I haven't seen any hands
I'm
up.
not going to do any cartography because I am really very hesitant about cartographing ethnicities and communities. It's very difficult and it's very tricky. Despite that, it's true that there is a sort of territorial community distribution. It was before the war and it is now. I would recommend you to go to a scholar, French scholar, who is called Fabrice Balanche. He has for decades been studying minorities, ethnicity, sectarianism in Syria, so his focus is very sectarian, so he will always tell you that identity is the key to understand everything, but he has been doing a wonderful work of sensing and registering population in Syria, and I think he might be the one who has more updated data and maps. He had been doing something with maps. He published something with maps as well. So go with Fabrice Balanche, and despite I don't share his approach, he's done a wonderful work.
Who's next?
Thank you for your talks. I also have a question to Lourdes Vidal. In this whole discourse about tribal identity and minority identities, how is identity defined? How is identity defined in those discourses you were talking about?
More questions? No, I'm going to ask one to Umut also. One, as you were started your inputs with the results of the Istanbul and Ankara elections, one of the elements which is quite new, I would say, or I'm asking whether it is new, is the fact that the Kurdish party did not run in Istanbul, and that the Kurdish voters seems, or those not Kurdish voters, the HDP voters massively voted for the CHP candidate. So here also, in a moment where we have had different lines of polarization in Turkey, because one is pro and anti-Erdogan, but the Kurdish issue has also been extremely polarizing, and there the CHP as a very nationalistic party was placed also on the opposite side of something like the HDP. I wanted to ask you whether you think that we have precedents of that, and whether you think that this is a game changer in the ways the HDP is going to act in Turkish politics, but also the way in which the CHP is going to relate to them. So whoever wants to start.
Okay. So how identity is defined, that is the main problem. Because who defines identity? I am entitled to define the identity of someone else. What I work is mainly on religious, ethnic, and tribe clan group solidarities, which is what I think that is easier to cope with. But you might also think and consider that within, for example, this heterogeneous Sunni Arab group, you have different identities, because you have the identities of those secularists, those practicing believers, those Sufis, those Islamists, those extreme Islamists. So you have different identities as well, and you might consider them as well identities. So it's clearly something quite complicated. And this is why I started saying, well, I have lots of dilemmas when regarding identity. But if you take ethnicity, I mean, it's not something that you relate with. I mean, ethnicity is something that you inherit. Religion is something that you inherit, but you can adhere or reject. And tribe and clan as well. I mean, it's something genetic, but you can adhere or reject. So you have different levels of identity, okay? And it's quite complicated to clearly define identities and separate identities from each other, and they overlap. This is also a complication. Different communities and different groups and different identities overlap. And this is why it's very complicated to separate them and to treat them as different variables and different elements. So we will have to keep on dealing with that, and probably we'll have to add to the analysis of identities in Syria these new identities that emerge within the communities, so that heterogeneity of Syrian society will be even more heterogeneous.
Yeah, I mean, just I mean, it's a very important point. I mean, there's nothing to answer in many ways, because it's just that, yes, that was the determinant, and actually one of the leading figures of HDP, Pervin Buldan, said after the elections that they won despite all odds, and they determined the loser, which was a great summary of what happened. And one important thing, and that's something that I forgot to mention, is that the whole elections showed us that maybe a new politician is in the making. I mean, if hopefully the next mayor of Istanbul, because AKP didn't concede yet, he thanked the Kurds separately. I mean, and unheard of, if you in terms of the current leader. He thanked the Kurds for their help. So maybe, who knows, maybe he takes over the party at some point. Maybe the whole bridges, the blocks that separate these groups will be destroyed. I mean, this is one of the hopeful things.
Someone else? Are you already too tired? Yeah, please.
Well, thank you all. My question is to Lourdes. Isn't it that sectarianism really started to manifest in Syria due to the contribution of al-Assad to the boost of jihadism and the intervention of regional powers? I mean, would you agree with this statement, or do you find other factors?
Someone else?
Yeah, and another question to Umut. Do you agree with that? One of the problems of Turkey to get a full democracy, if such thing exists, is that one of its pillars is this understanding of nationalism that rejects any, I don't know, manifestation of other cultures, languages, whatever. It's so strict nationalism. Thank you.
I don't know if you have any other question, otherwise, yeah, please.
Hi, thanks all for your talks. So my question was, so like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we talk about the Middle East, we heard about Sunnis and Shias, but like right now it seems impossible to talk about the Middle East without mentioning Alawite, Shia, Sufis, and all this. So like my questions to whoever wants to answer, is it all based on religion, or is it just like an excuse for political alliances? Like, for example, in Iraq or I don't know, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So is this all religion, or because this conflict between Shias and Sunnis, where like it comes from long time ago? So that was my question.
And then, as there was no question directly addressed to Anna, I'm going to address one to her, which is on the role of the new Prime Minister in Pakistan. Whether also either in his election, which kind of supports has he received from the regional powers you were describing? Are they meddling into Pakistani domestic politics? And whether you think that the foreign policy orientation of the current leadership in Pakistan has somehow changed because of him, or then it means that the politics of Pakistan, I mean, do not matter because the key foreign policy decisions are set elsewhere but not in the Prime Minister's office. So, Lourdes, okay.
It's true what you said, and it's not true. I mean, it's true that the Assad regime did everything to sectarize the conflict, because it granted, or it was the best way to grant him support from these minorities that could feel threatened by the revolutionary movement. it's true that the external influence, Iranians, Hezbollah, Saudis, etc., have brought much more sectarianism into the conflict. It is true that jihadists have promoted a clearly sectarian agenda against Shia population particularly. So, I mean, these actors have even increased sectarianism of the Syrian conflict, but sectarian rivalries, although they were mild and low level, low profile, existed previously, but to what extent, and this is my question, to what extent they were a consequence of religious, ethnic incompatibilities, or they were a consequence of a strategic policy of marginalizing some population, undermining some population, disempowering some population, and empowering some other. So this is the key issue. Obviously, there was a sort of mutual convenience between the regime and jihadists. It does not mean that there is an alliance, but there was mutual convenience. As long as they both attacked rebels, there were no confrontation, direct clashes between the regime and jihadists. Okay, at the beginning, because they were both attacking rebels. One of the probably the main actor that has suffered sectarianism the most, and probably is not an identity per se, but the segment of the population that has been more largely attacked and targeted by all groups, the regime, but also extreme radical rebel groups, is the pro-democracy segment of the population. This is the one that has been heavily diminished and heavily attacked. Most of them either are in exile or are dead or are in prison or are kidnapped by rebel groups. But this is really the segment of the population which you might, and because being pro-democracy is an identity, apparently not. But this is the group that with no clear identity affiliation has been more attacked and has suffered the most of all communities in Syria, because it's almost disappeared. It has almost disappeared from the Syrian scenario. And I think that I didn't have time to mention it during my intervention, that generational issues are very important. For example, if you see this divide, those Alawites that are against regime, you will see that there's young people that have other ideas on political systems, on democracy, that have other expectations. And they confront also their families that are more traditional, that want to preserve the statu quo, that want to keep their privileges. So this generational element, this generational divide, is also very important. I forgot to mention it before. And when you say this Sunni-Shia divide, okay, if you take into account the fitna, so the divide between these Muslims among Shia and Sunni, was provoked by political arguments. It was a political issue around succession of the Prophet. It was not about interpretations of religion or theological derivations. No, it was a political issue, and it is still today a political issue. But it's very useful to mobilize people using identity and using this community affiliation and the threat against a rival and rival identity. So, but on the ground, it's all political.
I mean, the answer to that question is very straightforward and very short. Of course it is. I mean, that's the main impediment. And let's not forget that, you know, in one way or another, Turkey is a country which is based on the foundations of a genocide and population exchange, and then basically looting and appropriating or nationalizing the properties of these people. So basically, you know, a country which was more than 20% non-Muslim at the beginning of the 20th century is not, right now, is 98% Muslim. That says it all. And that has never ceased to be a problem. And once again, I will dare to say that this is not only a Turkish problem.
Yes, before I answer your question, Edward, I agree with Lourdes on sectarianism. Yes, it's, and the fitna about, yes, political differences. But I think there's also a problem with who's legitimized to rule. And legitimacy may not just be political, but also religious. So I think there is an element of religion as well involved in power. So I usually, yeah.
It's true, Anna. And in the case of Syria, it's very true. To what extent such a minority group as the Alawites are entitled and legitimate to rule over a majority of Sunnis, okay? Taking into account particularly that Alawites are not any given Shia.
Yeah.
Some specific Shia that are really still rejected as Muslims for many Muslims. So this is something, this is an issue.
Yeah.
But what is first? The need to legitimate yourself in order to achieve power? Because at the end it's very linked, this legitimacy is very linked to the legitimacy in holding power. So it's very political at the same time. It's very mixed. I've always had this dilemma, Anna. When I was living in Syria, I had a friend who said that, okay, no, we Christians and Muslims live very well together, and the Shia and the Sunni, we live very well together. But every time I pass on the wall, on the street, and I see, I don't know how you say it in English, these las esquelas, these little notices where people say this person is dead, okay, but I said, when I saw one from a Christian, I said, yes, one less. And a Christian, when comes across the street and sees one Muslim say dead, says, yes, he's dead, one less. You know, and this was during peace times, and this was coexistence, and people lived well, and people respected. And my Sunni friend who said that one day made me crazy to seek for his Jewish doctor, who was the best doctor in the world. And he wouldn't allow anyone else to see him if it was not his Jewish doctor. So, I mean, yes, these differences, these imaginaries, these relations between identities and communities are there, but to what extent also why Alawites feel this need to reassert their power and find the legitimacy everywhere in any case, because also they have been persecuted for a long time in the past. So they are a scared community in a way. They have suffered persecution for a long time. So, you know, everything is explained by history. So this is why sectarianism exists, this is true, but I resist to explain everything on sectarian terms.
No, of course, I agree with that. So I'm just saying, I find it really difficult to divide, to differentiate that politic from the religious side. It's many times it's fused, so it's really difficult. But of course, religion is just one element of the analysis. It's not the main element at all. Okay, so I think essentialist and explanations of sectarianism fail to explain the problem. And going to your question, the new PM, well, he doesn't decide anything. He's a puppet. And he is of the military, of course. I mean, they're the ones who decide. They used to decide foreign policy, they used to decide defense, and now they also deciding domestic policies. So they're powerful. They have proved they no longer need to make a coup to be in power. So Imran Khan, in that sense, is the perfect prime minister because he doesn't have an ideology. He's got the ideology that comes out from military quarters, and that's it. So he doesn't make a decision. He's a puppet, and I don't think anything is going to change at all. And it will be the military still ruling Pakistan.
May I ask a question? No, because this morning I was taken here by a Pakistani taxi driver who was great, and we started to speak about news from Pakistan. And he was precisely telling, I asked him, what about the new prime minister? And he was saying, he's great. And he just mentioned corruption. He's clean, he's not going to be corrupt. And, you know, it was something, I don't know if this is something tricky that they have solved very well in the narrative to present him as a clean person, but the obsession was he's not a corrupt person.
And then also, if you could say about whether regional powers have intervened through the military in Pakistani politics or not, this has been purely domestic.
Yeah. Well, his campaign was based on eliminating corruption. And what he meant by that was eliminating the two main political parties, which is the Bhutto's party, which have many of its members have been in prison for corruption, and as well the Muslim League with Nawaz Sharif in jail as well. So he presented himself as non-corrupt, but he actually is. The problem in Pakistan is that corruption is selective. You are corrupt when the military begin to, you know, want you out of politics. So your corruption resurfaces. Otherwise, corruption is, you know, everyone is corrupted in Pakistan, including the military. And your question, oh, yes, when you see the news in Pakistan, you will always see the visit of some prime minister from, I don't know, anywhere, any country. And they visit, maybe they go shake hands of the president, who nobody knows who he is, the prime minister, but then they go to the military. And the ones they have a dialogue with, and with, you know, the serious consequences, everything, it's the military that decide, because they just don't have foreign policy, defense policy, and interior domestic policy. They also are an elite of their own. They also have lots of economic interests. They have their own enterprises. And for example, with China and the Belt and Road Initiative, they have used their own companies to sign contracts with the Chinese. So they're also an economic, you know, elite. So yes, it's military, basically.
So thank you all. Let me finish with one reflection, trying to, not to summarize, but just 3 ideas. First is that I think we saw and we confirmed that identity politics, with that definition, is one of the drivers of Middle Eastern dynamics at both the domestic and the regional level. That since 2011, the feeling of insecurity of certain communities has increased, feeling an existential threat, and this is what explained this process of securitization, as you were referring in the literature, but it doesn't mean that the agents of this process of securitization had a purely sectarian agenda in mind. Generally, as you were pointing out, it was the attempt to keep power or the attempt to reach power what explains many of the agendas of those securitizing and, if you want, sectarianizing actors in the Middle East. And then let me finish, because I was I think that the idea that, I don't know if it accidentally or not, but Anna put over the table about the sectarianization of security, it's very relevant and probably something we have not discussed that we could discuss another day, but which kind of links also the 3 cases. You explain now in the case of Pakistan as a result, well, the very creation of the state, but then also as a reaction to the Syria war. But then Syria, this is a process also where the security establishment has been heavily sectarianized. The Alawite factor first is something very much connected to the security establishment. Our colleague Ignacio Álvarez Osorio has also worked on that. And then on Turkey, perhaps it would be I'm less familiar with, but also with the relations between Alevism and the relation between Alevi security establishment and so on. That could be also something worth investigating. So perhaps we can turn concepts upside down and have a basis for a new debate next year. Thanks so much. Enjoy the city and enjoy the rest of the evening.